The bold declaration. The grand hall of the Zarkonian Empire was filled with silence. Hundreds of alien nobles, warriors, and officials stood in perfect rows, their glowing eyes fixed on the throne. At the center, on a golden platform, sat King Varzon, ruler of the Zarkonians. His face was stern, his golden crown reflecting the firelight from the tall torches. Tonight was an important night. The king's only daughter, Princess Styra, was to be given in marriage to General Karath, the strongest warlord in the empire. It was a political alliance, one that would make the empire stronger. The warlord stood tall beside the throne. His sharp, armored body gleamed like polished steel, and his red eyes burned with power. He had won countless battles, crushed his enemies, and now he would claim the princess as his bride. The ceremony was about to begin. But then, a single human stepped forward. Gasps filled the hall. The nobles whispered, confused and angry. A human. Here, what was he doing? The man's name was Captain Daniel Hayes. He was no king, no noble, no great warrior. He was just a soldier from Earth, a man who had fought in the deep space wars and survived, a man who knew when to fight and when to take a gamble. Daniel walked to the center of the hall. His boots echoed in the silence. He stood before the king, bold and unafraid. "I claim the right to take Princess Styra as my own," Daniel said. His voice was calm, steady. The hall exploded into chaos. Nobles shouted in rage. Warriors reached for their weapons. The warlord Karath let out a deep growl. His sharp claws twitched, eager to tear the human apart. The king's eyes burned with anger. "You dare," his voice thundered. "You, a mere human, think you can take what belongs to the empire." Daniel didn't move. He didn't flinch. "The ancient laws of Zarkonia allow any man to stake a claim on the princess," he said, "if he can prove himself worthy." The room fell silent again. The ancient laws. The king's hands tightened on his throne. Daniel was right. The old laws were written long before the Zarkonians had discovered space travel. No one had dared to invoke them before, because no one had ever been foolish enough to try. General Karath laughed. A low, deep, dangerous laugh. "You are a fool, human," he said. "Do you think you can challenge me? You are weak. Small. You are nothing." Daniel smiled slightly. "Then it should be easy for you to defeat me." The warlord's laughter stopped. His red eyes burned with fury. The king raised his hand, silencing the room. His face was cold. He looked at Daniel as if deciding whether to kill him now or later. "You understand the price of your challenge?" the king asked. "If you fail, you will not only lose your life, but your world, your people, Earth itself, will pay the price." Daniel nodded. "I understand." The princess, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but firm. "Why do you do this, human?" she asked. Daniel turned to look at her. She was beautiful, even by human standards. Her silver skin shimmered under the torchlight, her violet eyes sharp and intelligent. She wore a royal gown, her long white hair braided with golden bands. But Daniel wasn't claiming her because of her beauty. It was something else. Something deeper. "I have my reasons," he said simply. The princess held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. The king exhaled, his patience running out. "Very well, human," he said. "The challenge is accepted." He stood, his massive frame towering over everyone in the room. His voice rang like thunder. "To claim the princess, you must pass the 3 trials of Zarkonia." Murmurs spread through the hall. The 3 trials. No human had ever attempted them. No alien had ever survived them. Daniel didn't blink. "Name them." The king's lips curled into a cruel smile. "First, you will face the beast of the arena, a monster that has never been tamed. If it does not kill you, then the 2nd trial will. Second, the king continued, you will enter the mind labyrinth, a place where your deepest fears will become real. If your mind breaks, you will die screaming." Daniel remained still. "And the final trial," the king said, his voice low, "will be a duel to the death against General Karath himself." A wicked grin spread across the warlord's face. His sharp teeth gleamed. "I look forward to crushing you, human." The nobles laughed, already certain of Daniel's death. The king leaned forward. "You have one last chance, human. Withdraw now, and you will be spared." Daniel's answer was simple. "No." The king's fingers clenched into a fist. "Then so be it." He turned to his guards. "Take him. The first trial begins at dawn." The warriors grabbed Daniel's arms. He did not resist. He let them drag him away. The hall was filled with laughter and whispers of his doom. Only one person was silent. Princess Dvira watched as Daniel disappeared through the grand doors. A strange light shone in her violet eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt something new. Hope. The impossible challenge. The arena was silent. Thousands of Zarkonians filled the towering stone stands, their glowing eyes fixed on the circular battleground below. The arena of beasts, a place where warriors met their end, where blood was spilled, and where the weak were devoured. At the center stood Daniel Hayes, a lone human in a sea of aliens. His hands were empty, his breathing steady. He was not afraid. High above, on a golden throne, King Varzun watched with cold amusement. Beside him, General Karath grinned, his sharp claws tapping against his armrest. He was waiting, eager to see this human fail. Princess Xyra sat near them, her face unreadable. But deep inside, she felt something strange. What if he actually survived? A deep rumble shook the ground. The gates at the far end of the arena groaned open. The thick, unnatural mist slithered out, curling around the stone floor. And then it emerged. The beast was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. It stood 4 meters tall, its body covered in thick, black scales that shimmered like wet stone. Its head had 3 snarling mouths, each filled with rows of jagged silver teeth. 6 glowing red eyes locked onto Daniel, and its 4 massive, clawed arms flexed in anticipation. The crowd erupted into cheers. They had seen this before. The Kranath beast had never lost a battle. Daniel. He had no weapon, no armor, just his mind. A deep voice boomed across the arena. "Human, your trial begins. Survive, if you can." The beast let out a thunderous roar, a sound that sent shockwaves through the ground. The moment its jaws snapped open, it attacked. It moved fast, faster than anything that big should be able to. It lunged forward, all 3 mouths snapping at once. Daniel didn't run. Instead, he dropped low, rolling to the side just as the monster crashed into the ground where he had stood. Dust exploded into the air. The audience gasped. The beast twisted, its long tail whipping around, trying to crush him. Daniel saw it coming. He dived, barely avoiding the strike. The ground cracked beneath him. Karath laughed. "Run, human. Run while you can." Daniel wasn't running. He was watching, calculating. The beast roared again, lunging at him with all 6 arms. Daniel darted forward at the last second, sliding beneath its massive body. The monster swung wildly, but Daniel was too small, too quick. The crowd fell silent. No one had ever lasted this long. Daniel's mind worked fast. The beast had armor-like scales, too thick to break. It was stronger and faster than him. But there was always a weakness, always. Then he saw it. The eyes. Its middle set of eyes didn't move as quickly as the others. They lagged slightly behind. It had a blind spot. Daniel grinned. The beast charged again. This time, Daniel didn't dodge far. He moved just enough, baiting it forward. The creature roared and smashed into the stone wall behind him, its thick skull cracking the surface. The crowd gasped. The monster shook its head, dazed. Daniel ran toward it. The king leaned forward, The warlord's grin faded. The human was fighting back. Daniel jumped onto the creature's back, grabbing onto its thick scales. The monster roared in anger, thrashing wildly, but Daniel held on. He climbed higher, reaching its head. The creature screamed, trying to shake him loose. And then, Daniel attacked. Using all his strength, he jammed his fingers into its middle set of eyes. The beast let out an earth-shaking screech. Its entire body convulsed in pain. It stumbled, claws scratching at its own face, trying to rip Daniel off. The arena was in chaos. Daniel jumped off just in time. The beast, blind and confused, turned wildly, too wildly. It lost its balance. With a final, desperate roar, it collapsed onto the stone floor. Its massive body twitched, and then went still. Silence. No one spoke. No one breathed. The impossible had happened. A human had won. Daniel stepped forward, covered in sweat and dust, staring up at the king. "One trial down, Your Majesty," he said. His voice was calm, unshaken. The king's face was unreadable, but Karath was furious. His sharp claws dug into his throne. Princess Zyra. She simply smiled. For the first time in history, a human had changed the game. And there were still 2 trials left, outsmarting death. The roar of the crowd still echoed in the grand arena, but Daniel Hayes had no time to celebrate. The first trial had ended in victory, but the second was about to begin. And this time, he wasn't fighting a monster. He was fighting his own mind. High above, King Varzun sat on his throne, watching Daniel with unreadable eyes. The human had survived the beast of the arena. No one had expected it. General Karath, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to rip Daniel apart with his bare hands. His pride had been wounded. He wanted blood. And Princess Zyra. She leaned forward slightly, watching Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite place. A voice boomed across the arena. "The second trial begins." The floor beneath Daniel shifted. Stone slabs slid apart with a deep, grinding sound, revealing a dark passageway leading underground. Cold air whispered from below, carrying the scent of something old, something unnatural. Daniel's muscles tensed. The king raised a hand. "You will now enter the mind labyrinth, a place where your deepest fears come alive. If you lose yourself inside, you will never return." A Zarkonian guard shoved Daniel forward. "Enter, human." Daniel looked at the tunnel. It was black, endless, waiting to swallow him whole. He took a deep breath. No hesitation, no fear. And then he stepped inside. The moment Daniel crossed the threshold, the stone door slammed shut behind him. Darkness. A heavy, suffocating blackness surrounded him, pressing against his skin. He couldn't see his hands. He couldn't hear his own breath. It was like he had been dropped into an empty void. Then, a whisper, low, cold, crawling through the silence. "You are nothing." Daniel turned sharply. He knew that voice. Another whisper, this time from the opposite side. "You should have died long ago." A cold shiver ran down his spine. The darkness shifted. It moved, forming shapes, flickering images, memories. Suddenly, he wasn't in the labyrinth anymore. He was back on Earth. The sky was burning. Daniel stood in the middle of a ruined battlefield. Buildings collapsed around him. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of death. He knew this place. The Battle of Arcadia IV. The day he lost everything. His team was there. His comrades, the men and women he had fought beside for years. They were dying. A soldier near him, Richards, his best friend, his brother in arms. He was lying on the ground, reaching out. "Daniel, help me." Daniel ran forward, but the moment he touched Richards, he turned to ash. The wind carried his remains away, leaving Daniel alone. No, this isn't real. Daniel clenched his fists. He knew what this was. A trick. The labyrinth was digging into his mind, using his worst memories against him. Another voice spoke, soft, familiar. "You can't escape this, Daniel." His breath caught. He turned and saw her. A woman stood in front of him, dressed in a simple uniform, her dark hair pulled back. Sarah, his wife, the woman he had loved and lost. She smiled at him, but her eyes were empty. Dead. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't real. He took a step back. "You're not her." Sarah tilted her head. "If I'm not real, then why does it hurt?" Her form flickered like a glitch in a broken screen. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The battlefield vanished. Daniel was back in the darkness of the labyrinth, his breath sharp, his hands trembling. The whispers came again. "Give up, human. You cannot fight your own mind." Daniel closed his eyes. He slowed his breathing, and then he did something unexpected. He stopped fighting. He let the darkness wash over him. Let the voices speak. Let the fear come. But instead of running, instead of trying to push it away, he accepted it. He knew this was a trick. And a trick only worked if you believed it. A deep hum vibrated through the air. The darkness around him shook. The whispers grew frantic, confused. The labyrinth was losing control. Daniel opened his eyes. Everything was clear now. The way forward, the way out. He took a step, then another. And suddenly, the darkness shattered. He was back in the arena. The crowd gasped. The king's eyes narrowed. Daniel stood at the center, completely unarmed, his mind unbroken. Karath looked furious. No one had ever escaped the mind labyrinth. Daniel smirked. "Nice trick," he said, dusting himself off. "But I've seen worse." The king's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You have passed the second trial, human." The crowd erupted into whispers. The impossible had happened twice. Princess Elvira, for the first time, looked truly impressed. But Daniel wasn't done yet. There was still one more trial. And this time, it wouldn't be a test. It would be a fight to the death. The warlord's trap. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the palace balcony, staring down at the alien city below. The streets of Zarkonia glowed with golden lights, stretching endlessly into the darkness. From up here, everything seemed peaceful. But he knew better. Tomorrow, he would face General Karath in a duel to the death. The third and final trial. The last obstacle between him and Princess Tyra. Between victory and death. Daniel took a slow breath. His body ached from the first two trials, but his mind was sharp. He needed rest, but something in his gut told him sleeping would be a mistake that could get him killed. Elsewhere in the palace, Karath was furious. He paced through the war chambers, his red eyes burning with rage. The human had survived 2 trials. Impossible. No one had ever done that before. King Varazan sat on his throne, watching the warlord silently. Unlike Karath, he was not angry. He was calculating. "The human is clever," the king finally said. "More clever than I expected." Karath slammed his fist against the stone wall. "Clever or not, he will not survive the third trial." The king's eyes narrowed. "Are you so sure?" Karath bared his sharp teeth. "If we wait until the duel, there is a small chance he might win. But if he doesn't survive the night..." The king sighed. "You would break the law." Karath smiled darkly. "Accidents happen." The king did not stop him. Daniel sensed it before it happened. A shifting in the shadows, a change in the air. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he let his fingers brush against the small knife hidden at his waist. Then he heard it. The softest sound. A footstep, barely there. They were here. Daniel moved fast. He twisted, dodging just as a blade slashed where his neck had been a second before. Assassins. 3 of them. Tall, lean, dressed in dark armor. Their reptilian faces were covered by thin masks. Each one held a curved dagger coated in something thick and black. Poison. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged forward. The first assassin slashed again, but Daniel ducked, grabbing his arm and twisting. There was a sharp snap, a bone breaking. The assassin hissed in pain, but Daniel was already moving. The second assassin struck from behind. Daniel threw himself sideways, dodging at the last second. The knife barely missed his ribs. But the third assassin was faster. A blade cut into Daniel's shoulder. Pain exploded through his arm. Daniel gritted his teeth. No time to stop. He spun, driving his elbow into the attacker's throat. The alien choked, staggering backward. The second assassin attacked again. This time, Daniel was ready. He grabbed the alien's own knife and drove it straight into his chest. The assassin collapsed. Daniel turned to the last one. For a moment, they stared at each other. Then, the assassin ran. Daniel wasn't about to let him escape. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, he chased after him. The assassin sprinted through the palace halls, moving like a shadow. But Daniel was faster. As they passed through a narrow corridor, Daniel grabbed a loose hanging curtain, yanking it down. The heavy fabric tangled around the assassin's legs, and he fell hard. Before he could get up, Daniel was on him, pressing a knife to his throat. "Who sent you?" Daniel demanded, breathing hard. The assassin sneered. "You already know." Daniel pressed the knife harder. "Say it." The assassin hesitated, then laughed. "You may have survived this," he whispered, "but the warlord will rip you apart tomorrow." Daniel's eyes were cold. "We'll see." Then, with one swift motion, he knocked the assassin unconscious. By the time the sun rose, the palace was buzzing with rumors. Someone had tried to kill the human challenger. Karath denied everything. He stood in the arena, fully armored, his energy blades glowing red. Daniel stood across from him, his wounds hidden beneath his torn shirt. His knife was gone, replaced with a simple short sword. The king raised his hand. "The final trial begins." Karath smiled. "No tricks this time, human." Daniel smirked back. "Who needs tricks?" The warlord charged, and the duel began. The duel for honor. The arena was silent. Thousands of Zarkonians filled the towering stands, their glowing eyes locked on the two figures standing in the center of the battleground. Daniel Hayes, a lone human. General Karath, the Empire's most feared warlord. This was the final trial, a fight to the death. No tricks, no second chances, only one would leave the arena alive. High above, King Varazon sat on his throne, his face carved from stone. Beside him, Princess Xyra watched with an unreadable expression. Daniel had survived the impossible. The beast of the arena, the mind labyrinth, an assassination attempt in the dead of night. But now, none of that mattered. Now he had to fight. The king raised his hand. "Begin." Karath moved first. He was fast, too fast for something that big. His twin energy blades burned red as he slashed forward, aiming to cut Daniel in half in a single strike. Daniel barely dodged. He felt the heat of the blades as they sliced the air inches from his chest. He rolled to the side, coming up on his feet, his short sword raised. It felt heavy in his hands. His shoulder still ached from the assassination attempt. His body was screaming for rest. But rest was death. Karath lunged again, faster this time. His blades struck like lightning, each attack meant to kill. Daniel blocked the first strike, barely. The impact sent a jolt through his entire arm. The second strike. He wasn't fast enough. Karath's blade cut into his side. Pain. Sharp. Deep. The crowd cheered. Daniel staggered back, pressing a hand against his wound. Warm blood leaked between his fingers. Karath grinned, circling him like a predator. "Is that all, human?" The warlord taunted. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have the breath to waste. Instead, he watched. Karath was stronger, faster, armed with superior weapons. If Daniel fought him head-on, he was already dead. But Karath wasn't invincible. Daniel had spent hours watching him, studying him. Even before the duel began, he had been looking for a weakness. And now, he had found one. The warlord's attacks were aggressive, brutal, overwhelming, but they had one flaw. Karath fought like a warrior who had never lost. He never expected his opponent to survive more than a few seconds, and because of that, he was predictable. Karath lunged again, slashing high. Daniel didn't dodge. He stepped forward. The warlord's eyes widened in surprise, just for a fraction of a second. And that was all Daniel needed. He twisted to the side, letting the blade barely scrape past him. At the same time, he dropped low, driving his elbow into Karath's ribs. The warlord stumbled. The crowd gasped. Daniel didn't stop. He spun behind Karath, slashing at the back of his leg. The blade cut deep. Karath roared in pain. He whirled, swinging both his blades wildly. Daniel ducked, rolled, and struck again, this time aiming for his opponent's wrist. A clean hit. Karath's left blade fell from his hand. The arena erupted into shock. The great warlord, the undefeated champion of the Zarkonian Empire, was losing. Karath's breathing was heavy. His red eyes burned with fury. "You dare," he growled. Daniel wiped blood from his face. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "I dare." The warlord charged. Daniel had expected rage, but this was different. This was desperation. Karath's strikes were reckless now, sloppy. Daniel dodged left, right, a step back, a twist. His body screamed in pain, but he ignored it. Then, in a single perfect moment, he saw his chance. Karath raised his remaining blade, leaving his chest wide open. Daniel moved. One step forward, a twist of his wrist. And then, his blade was buried deep in Karath's heart. The warlord's red eyes widened. He gasped, trying to speak, but no words came. Daniel pulled his sword free. Karath staggered, dropping to his knees, his head tilted up, looking at the king. Then, he fell, dead. The arena was silent. No one moved. For the first time in history, a human had defeated the Empire's greatest warrior. The king stood slowly. His face gave nothing away. Daniel stared up at him. He was exhausted, bleeding, barely standing. But he had won. The ancient law was clear. The princess was his. Would the king honor the law, or break it? The answer would change everything. The king's betrayal. The arena was silent. Karath's lifeless body lay in the dust, his twin energy blades flickering and dim. The undefeated warlord, the Empire's greatest champion, was dead. And the one who had killed him, a human. Daniel Hayes stood over his fallen opponent, breathing hard. Blood dripped from the wound in his side, mixing with the dirt beneath his feet. His grip tightened on his sword, its blade stained red. He looked up. High above, King Varzan remained seated on his golden throne, his expression unreadable. The entire court of Zarkonian nobles watched in stunned silence, waiting. Daniel had won. By the ancient laws of the Empire, Princess Xyra now belonged to him. But the king wasn't speaking. A cold feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. Something was wrong. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the king slowly rose from his throne. His golden robes shimmered in the firelight, and his deep, rumbling voice echoed through the arena. A remarkable feat. His tone was smooth, measured, too controlled. Daniel didn't like it. The king's glowing yellow eyes locked onto him. "A human warrior has slain my greatest general. The laws are clear. But tell me, human, do you truly believe you deserve my daughter?" Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew where this was going. "The law says I do," he said, keeping his voice steady. The king smiled, but it was not a kind smile. Laws can change. The crowd gasped. Daniel's chest tightened. This was a trap. The king had no intention of honoring the ancient law. He never did. The trials weren't a test to prove Daniel's worth. They were a way to get rid of him. And now that he had survived, the king was ready to break his own rules. Daniel's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. He glanced toward Princess Syra. Her face was blank, but her violet eyes burned with something fierce. Rage. This wasn't just a betrayal of Daniel. It was a betrayal of her. The king lifted a hand. A dozen Zarkonian royal guards stepped forward, their plasma rifles aimed directly at Daniel's chest. "Kneel," the king commanded. Daniel didn't move. The guards took a step closer. The nobles in the stands leaned forward, waiting for the execution. The human had come so far, but now he would die like all the rest. Daniel exhaled slowly. His body ached, his side was bleeding, and his muscles screamed in protest. But he wasn't about to kneel. Instead, he laughed. It was quiet at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the arena. The nobles stared in confusion. Even the king raised an eyebrow. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow and looked up at the throne. "You know," he said, "I expected this. Power-hungry kings tend to play the same dirty games." The king's smile faded. Daniel tilted his head. "Problem is, I don't play by your rules." And then he moved. Faster than the guards could react, Daniel lunged forward, grabbing one of them by the arm and jerking him sideways. The plasma rifle fired, but the shot went wide, hitting another guard instead. Chaos erupted. Daniel yanked the fallen guard's weapon from his hands, spinning it around and firing. A second soldier dropped. The crowd exploded into shouts. The nobles scrambled back. The royal guards rushed forward. Daniel turned sharply and came face to face with Princess Syra. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she grabbed a dagger from the folds of her gown and tossed it to him. Daniel caught it without hesitation. "You saved me once," Syra whispered. "Now I save you." And then she moved. With a single motion, she drove her blade into the nearest guard's throat. The king's face twisted in shock. His daughter, his own blood, was betraying him. The game had changed. Daniel and Syra fought side by side, cutting through the wave of guards. Plasma blasts lit up the night, sparks flying from clashing weapons. Daniel ducked, rolling beneath a sword strike before slamming the hilt of his dagger into a guard's ribs. The alien staggered back, and Daniel finished him with a clean shot to the head. Syra moved with deadly grace, her blade finding gaps in armor, her strikes precise and ruthless. She wasn't fighting like a princess. She was fighting like a warrior. But there were too many. More soldiers flooded the arena surrounding them. Daniel cursed. He was running out of time. Then a deep rumble shook the ground. Everyone froze. A shadow fell over the arena as the sky turned black. Daniel looked up and saw the impossible. A human warship. Earth had arrived. The king's face paled as the massive battleship hovered above the city. Its cannons glowed with power. A booming voice crackled through the comms. "This is Admiral Carter of the Terran Fleet. We have received word that our captain was placed in an unfair trial. Zarkonian King, release him now." Daniel's lips curled into a smirk. His backup had arrived. The king clenched his fists. His entire empire was watching. If he ordered Daniel's execution now, he risked war with Earth. Daniel took a step forward, sword still in hand. "I won fair and square," he said. "The princess is mine. You can either honor the law or lose everything." The king's face twisted in rage. But he knew the truth. The humans triumph. The air was thick with tension. Daniel Hayes stood in the center of the grand arena, his body covered in blood and dust, his sword still gripped tightly in his hand. Around him, The Zarkonian royal guards had lowered their weapons, stepping back with hesitant glances toward their king. High above, King Varzon stood frozen on his throne. His golden robes barely moved, his glowing eyes locked onto the human who had defied him. In the sky above the palace, the Terran warship hovered like an iron fist ready to strike. The entire Zarkonian Empire had just witnessed the impossible. A human had defeated their greatest warrior, survived their deadliest trials, and forced their king into an impossible choice. And now, everything was about to change. The silence stretched. The king clenched his fists, his sharp nails digging into his own palms. His entire life, he had ruled with absolute authority. No one defied him. No one challenged his word. But this human, this outsider, had done what no Zarkonian had dared. And worse, his own daughter had sided with him. Varzon turned to Princess Xyra. She stood beside Daniel, her violet eyes burning with quiet defiance. There was no fear in her gaze, only resolve. His own blood had betrayed him. The king exhaled slowly. He could order the execution anyway. Ignore the Terran fleet, kill the human, and deal with the consequences. But deep inside, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about tradition anymore. If he gave the order, he would be remembered as the king who lost the empire. Not to war, not to invasion, but to a single human. The nobles held their breath. The soldiers waited for a command. And then, the king raised his hand. The law must be honored. Gasps rippled through the court. The royal guard snapped to attention. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Had he just won? The king's voice was heavy, but firm. By ancient decree, the princess's fate has been claimed. The human is victorious. A moment passed. Then, Xyra turned toward Daniel, and for the first time she smiled. A real smile. Not one of diplomacy, not one of forced duty, but one of choice. The Terran warship above powered down its weapons. The nobles in the stands muttered in shock. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to process what had just happened. He had won. The king had accepted the outcome. The entire Zarkonian Empire had just witnessed the unthinkable. A human, one single human, had challenged the might of the empire and walked away victorious. Daniel turned to Xyra. So what now? Her smile widened slightly. That depends on you, Captain. He smirked. Guess we should get out of here before your father changes his mind. She chuckled. Agreed. But just as Daniel took a step toward the exit, the king spoke again. Human. Daniel stopped. Turned. The king's expression was unreadable, but his voice held something different this time. Respect. I do not like you, the king admitted, but you have proven something today. He exhaled. Perhaps your kind are not as weak as we believed. Daniel grinned. Glad you're catching up, Your Majesty. A flicker of amusement crossed the king's face before he stood tall again. Take my daughter, take your victory. But know this, the empire watches you now. You carry the weight of what you have won. Daniel nodded. I can live with that. The king's gaze lingered a moment longer. Then he turned away. The matter was settled. As Daniel and Xyra made their way toward the Terran warship, the entire empire watched them go. Some with admiration, some with rage, some with fear, because they all knew the truth. The age of human weakness was over. And this was only the beginning. He was trapped. Slowly, he lifted a trembling hand. Stand down, he ordered. The guards hesitated, but obeyed. The battle was over. Daniel turned to Xyra. She smiled. And just like that, everything changed.